Hey everyone, Mr. DVB here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Resident Evil 3 remake that released earlier this year back in April. Originally, I was planning on getting this game at launch and reviewing it for everyone, but decided not to after hearing that the game only took 4 to 5 hours to complete. Being that this was a full-price title, I decided that I would just wait for a deep sale. Just a few days ago, I was browsing on PlayStation Store for things to spend my Christmas gift cards on, and I found the game for only $26, initially $80 Canadian. So I decided I would buy it, as I previously played the Resident Evil 2 remake nearly 2 years ago, which you can find a review for on my channel, as well as Resident Evil 7 Biohazard a few years back. Both games I enjoyed quite a bit. So after completing Resident Evil 3 after only 4 hours and 15 minutes, let's talk about my thoughts on this game. Resident Evil 3 follows an extremely basic premise. A giant zombie outbreak has flooded the streets of Raccoon City, and playing as Jill Valentine, you must fight your way through the streets whilst being pursued by the terrifying abomination codenamed Nemesis to find a way to make a cure. All in all, this game has pretty much the exact same story as the second game, this time around with a different cast of characters as well as a different location. In 2, you played in a giant police station that was once a library. In 3, you played in the streets of Raccoon City, making your way through stores and buildings. All in all, the story here was very forgettable, but I don't entirely care, as the second game was the exact same way, and it's not necessarily the most important aspect when it comes to these games. Character-wise, I found 3 to be a bit weaker than 2. The main protagonist, Jill, was fine I suppose, but I didn't like her as much as I recall liking Leon in the previous title, and I wasn't even a huge fan of him either. Otherwise, all of the side characters here are pretty forgettable as well, without much to make them stand out. Gameplay here is the exact same as the Resident Evil 2 remake, meaning all of the same positive aspects as well as issues are present. Aiming with your guns can be pretty difficult, which I feel is an intentional design choice to amp up tension and make it feel like every shot counts, as enemies are pretty bullet spongy and ammo can be at times scarce. Player movement can be a bit sluggish as well, like it was in the previous title. I don't dislike it overall, but it can feel a bit slow, especially when being pursued by enemies during chase sequences, of which the game has a few. The one new mechanic here, however, is dodging, which can be done by simply pressing the right bumper. You'll have to time it in order to avoid enemies. If done properly, the game will slow down and give you a chance to land a critical hit. One aspect of gameplay I found to be severely lacking in 3 compared to 2 was puzzles. 2 offered a good selection of brain twisters, such as one involving chess pieces. All of 3's puzzles quite often boiled down to you locating a couple of items that would then unlock a new area. It was disappointing to see this, as the previous games had some pretty fun puzzles in the past. Boss-wise, Resident Evil 3 was pretty good for the most part. None of them offered much of a challenge, and the designs were pretty simple overall, but I enjoyed them for what they were. To be honest, I can't really remember any of the boss fights from 2, so it wasn't a huge deal. Overall, gameplay here is pretty much the exact same. Player movement, gunplay, etc. is all ported over here, which causes the game to sort of feel like an expansion rather than an entirely different sequel, but I already really liked the gameplay present in 2, so I suppose if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Graphically, things are pretty much the exact same thing here as well, which isn't a bad thing in any way. I played this on the PS5, which was running the game through backwards compatibility, so in other words, the PS4 Pro version, and I found it to look really nice overall. The textures were good all around, and I thought the city looked pretty nice. The HDR issues present in 2 weren't as noticeable, so I didn't find the game to be as washed out looking as the previous entry. The city itself was pretty linear design, and you only really get to explore a couple of streets and alleyways, which is a bit disappointing. I do think it hurts it a bit from a horror standpoint, as 2 felt a lot more claustrophobic since you were in a building with narrow hallways, but at the same time the amount of rooms made it like a giant maze to traverse through. Here, I found it pretty easy to head from location to location without getting lost along the way. While I still enjoyed the streets, it wasn't as memorable as the station from the previous title. But there is a small portion of the game here in which you can revisit that area, which was fun to see, especially since this is set just before 2. I did find some things like reflections to sometimes have a very weird, messy look to them, and fire always looked pretty bad. The biggest issue presentation-wise, however, was the audio, specifically coming from dialogue. Characters always sounded super flat and poor, and during cutscenes it was almost impossible to understand them with how muffled and quiet it was. I tried screwing around with my sound settings, but it really didn't fix much.
No! Do you have any idea what you've just done?
No, don't care. My client ordered me to reduce umbrella to rub.
10 minutes.
As for creature designs, they all looked really good here. Zombies were gruesome with their jaws dangling from their face, and there's some larger beasts with sharp claws that you'll find running around, and they were pretty awesome to see as well. But the best design here is by far Nemesis, who will change throughout the course of the game after you fight him more and more. Speaking of which, I found Nemesis to be a little bit of a letdown considering all of the hype surrounding him before the game's release, with a lot of people referring to him as being even more terrifying than Mr. X. I personally didn't feel this way. What made Mr. X terrifying was that he was constantly after you. You could always hear his footsteps nearing closer or above you if you're on a different floor. You knew he was always looking for you, and the music that played when he would track you down was terrifying. Nemesis, on the other hand, doesn't show up as often, and when he does, it's usually a scripted event like a boss fight, where there isn't exactly a ton of suspense heading in. The few sections he does go after you are pretty good. He can grab you from a decent ways away with his tentacle arm, and can even jump in front of your path while you try to run away, which definitely made him at times more difficult than Mr. X, but I didn't find him scarier overall. All in all, I enjoyed my time with the remake of Resident Evil 3. Everything here is ported over from the Resident Evil 2 remake, so the gunplay and player movement was all equally as satisfying as it was before. Throughout the short experience, I enjoyed a good selection of thrilling moments and action-packed set pieces, but this time around, I found the game to be less scary. There were still some very tense sections, however. A hospital section in particular had me on the edge of my seat. The location of the game was lacking the maze-like feel present in 2, so I quite often felt like I was just heading from point A to point B without any real issue, whereas with 2 I would get lost, and that definitely made the game more terrifying to experience. I've heard a lot of people discuss how the developers removed some content from the original, including some iconic locations and boss fights, which is sad to see. The game is definitely short overall, and there were some moments where I definitely felt like the game was skipping over some pretty big sequences that I'm sure contain stuff in between. Overall, the game is fun, but definitely not worth full price, due to its insanely short completion time. I managed to complete the game in just over 4 hours, which is definitely not worth paying full price for. Capcom did include an online Resident Evil game with this that I've heard pretty mixed things about, and I don't plan on trying it out myself anytime soon. All in all, it feels like it should have just been a DLC for 2, otherwise the game could have stayed in development for a little bit longer and include some of those cut sequences from the original version. Overall, I enjoyed my short time with this game, and I would recommend picking it up if you can get it for a good sale price.